Welcome to Detective Duo, where classic mysteries come alive, from quiet villages to secret meetings with Tommy and Tuppence themselves. Do remember to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight. The evening had settled over London like a damp woolen cloak, heavy with drizzle and the faint scent of soot. Outside, the lamps along Audley Square were misty halos. Inside, the small detective agency of Beresford Investigations held a fugitive warmth, the glow of a coal fire, the steady tick of the clock, and the faint rustle of papers that sounded far more purposeful than they were. Tommy Beresford, his chair tilted back and his pipe drawing comfortably, was engaged in the modest exercise of reading a file he already knew by heart. Tuppence, seated opposite and neatly cataloguing the week's correspondence, had long since learned to recognise that expression, the one suggesting that her husband's mind had slipped away from invoices and client reports to far more interesting possibilities. "Tommy," she said without looking up, "if you're going to stare at that file as though it might suddenly sprout intrigue, you may as well admit you're bored." He sighed contentedly. "Bored, my dear girl, is such a cruel word. I'm merely waiting for the world to do something worth our attention." Tuppence smiled faintly. "In other words, you want another mystery." Before Tommy could reply, the bell over the door gave a single, sharp jangle, the kind that always sounded too timid or too urgent, depending on one's expectations. This time, it was the latter. The door opened upon a rush of cold air and a figure that seemed to bring the fog in with her. The young woman stood there for a moment, breathless, cheeks pale under the gaslight. Her coat was wet through, her gloved hands clasped tightly around a worn leather handbag. "Oh, forgive me," she began, voice trembling. "Are you Mr. and Mrs. Beresford?" Tuppence rose at once, her natural briskness cloaked in gentleness. "Yes, indeed. Do come in, my dear. You look frozen to the bone. Tommy, close the door before she turns into a snow sculpture." Tommy obeyed, ushering the woman toward the fire. She hesitated only a moment before stepping forward, as though every motion cost her courage. "I'm terribly sorry to intrude so late," she said. "My name is Miss Eleanor Vale. I hardly know how to begin." "Beginning is often the best way," Tommy offered with a reassuring smile. "A chair by the fire, a cup of tea, and the rest follows naturally. Albert swore by it in the war, though his patients were generally more mechanical than moral." Tuppence poured from the teapot that had been waiting on the side table. She had long since learned that mysteries arrived more dependably after supper than before. Eleanor accepted the cup with unsteady hands. The firelight showed her face more clearly now, delicate features, eyes too large for peace of mind, and the unmistakable look of someone balancing on the edge of confession. "I am, or was, a governess," she began, "employed at number 12 Hollow Street, Kensington, the household of Mr. and Mrs. Grant. They've been very kind to me, until recently." Tommy exchanged a glance with Tuppence, that subtle flicker of partnership that needed no words. "What changed?" Tuppence asked softly. Eleanor swallowed. "Mrs. Grant received a letter about a month ago. Anonymous. The handwriting was odd, angular. Another came just last week. The same words." She paused, her breath catching on the last words as if they still echoed. "Whitby Cliffs," Tommy repeated, thoughtful. "A charming seaside spot for a holiday, but hardly where one expects anonymous threats." "It terrified her," Eleanor said quickly. "Mrs. Grant has been ill ever since. She speaks of old sins, of justice catching up. Her husband dismisses it all as nonsense, but you don't." Eleanor's eyes lifted to Tuppence's. "No, there's something dreadful about the way she looks at him, as if she knows something she daren't speak aloud. And Mr. Grant—" She broke off, twisting her gloves. "He frightens me. I don't know why. He's always been polite, even kind, but now, there's something watchful in him, like a man waiting for someone to make a mistake." A droplet of rain struck the window pane. The sound made her flinch. Tommy leaned back, tapping his pipe against the grate. "And what is it you'd like us to do, Miss Vale?" Eleanor hesitated. "I don't quite know. I thought, perhaps you could see her, Mrs. Beresford. You might persuade her to tell the truth before something awful happens." There it was, the unspoken dread that had followed her through the fog. Tuppence regarded her steadily. "Do you believe she means to harm herself?" Eleanor's voice fell to a whisper. "Yes, unless someone stops her." Silence filled the room, broken only by the soft hiss of the fire. Outside, a motorcar splashed through the street, its lights sweeping briefly across the frosted glass. Tommy rose, his manner brisk now, all idle humour gone. "Hollow Street, Kensington, you said? We'll call tomorrow morning." Eleanor's relief was almost painful to watch. She nodded quickly, murmuring thanks, but as she rose to leave, Tuppence's gaze caught something peculiar, a faint smudge on the cuff of the girl's glove, dark, almost reddish. "Wait," Tuppence said lightly. "You've dirtied your glove." Eleanor looked down, startled. "Oh, ink, I think. From the post," she stammered, but her hand trembled as she wiped it against her coat. Tommy smiled pleasantly. A useful profession, the post. People rarely appreciate how many secrets travel through it. She gave a nervous laugh, too quick, and moved toward the door. "Thank you. I shouldn't have come, I know, but I couldn't think of anyone else." When the door closed behind her, the room seemed suddenly quieter, the ticking clock more pronounced. Tuppence crossed to the window, parting the curtain just enough to watch Miss Vale hurry away, her figure melting into the fog. "She's frightened of something," she said softly, "but not only for Mrs. Grant, for herself." Tommy nodded. "She's holding something back. That smudge on her glove, it wasn't ink, looked more like sealing wax." "From the letter?" "Possibly, which means she's handled it, perhaps even posted it." Tuppence turned, one brow arched. "You think she's the blackmailer?" "I think," he said slowly, "that fear wears many disguises. She may be running from guilt, or from someone else's secret entirely." The fire shifted, throwing their shadows long across the floor. Tuppence drew the curtains tight. "We'll find out tomorrow. I don't like that address. Hollow Street sounds as if it's waiting to swallow people whole." Tommy chuckled softly, though his eyes were thoughtful. "Then we shall pay it a visit, lanterns in hand, hearts stout, and all that." But even as he spoke, a faint unease settled between them, the sense that somewhere in the maze of fog-drenched streets the story had already begun, and they were walking straight into its heart. Outside, the rain thickened, tapping on the panes like hesitant fingers. In the hearth, the fire sank to embers, whispering its own small warning as the clock marked the hour. Tomorrow would bring Hollow Street, and with it, the first hint of the reckless choice that would unravel everything. Morning brought a thin London light that seemed reluctant to admit it was day at all. The fog had lifted only slightly, leaving behind a silvery dampness that clung to the streets like old secrets. Tommy Beresford, with his hat at an optimistic angle and his overcoat neatly brushed, surveyed the row of houses on Hollow Street with an expression of mild disapproval. "Well, this is certainly a cheerful address," he remarked. "One imagines the milk gives up halfway along and turns back." Beside him, Tuppence, muffled in a scarf that matched the blue of her eyes, gave a quick, dry laugh. "You're only annoyed because it isn't the sort of case that begins with a dead body and ends with applause. Try to look like an agent of benevolence, darling. We're here to prevent a tragedy, not enjoy one." They reached number 12, a house that might once have been handsome but now had the air of someone waiting too long for good news. The lace curtains were drawn even though it was 10 o'clock, and the brass knocker wore its layer of tarnish like deliberate camouflage. Tommy rang. After a pause long enough for a change of heart, the door opened to reveal a girl in a plain uniform, her eyes wide and wary. "Yes, sir," she said, voice low. "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford to see Mrs. Grant," Tuppence told her. "We've been expected." The maid hesitated, glancing over her shoulder down a dim hall, then stepped aside. "Yes, ma'am. This way, please." They were led through a narrow passage that smelled faintly of furniture polish and anxiety. The daylight fought to enter through the curtained windows, reduced to a ghostly glow that revealed more dust than decor. "Cheerful little place," Tommy murmured under his breath. "Hush," Tuppence whispered back. "It's listening." At the end of the passage, the maid stopped before a pair of double doors. Her fingers fidgeted with her apron ties before she pushed one door open and announced in a stifled voice, "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford." The room they entered was spacious, yet somehow claustrophobic. Lace curtains filtered what little daylight there was into a perpetual twilight. A fire burned low in the grate, more for companionship than heat. On a chaise near the hearth sat Mrs. Felicia Grant, slender, exquisitely dressed, and so pale that her gold brooch gleamed like a wound against her dark gown. She rose halfway, extended a trembling hand, then sank back with a faint smile. "How good of you to come," she murmured. "Eleanor told me you were understanding people." Tuppence came forward, her manner brisk but kind. "We do our best, Mrs. Grant. You've had a shock, I understand." Mrs. Grant's eyes, a washed-out grey like the sea under fog, flickered nervously toward the mantelpiece, where a letter lay half-hidden beneath a vase of lilies. "Yes, a shock," she repeated as though testing the word. "Such a small thing, really. Just a letter." "Anonymous ones rarely are small," Tommy said. Before Mrs. Grant could answer, the door opened again, and Leonard Grant entered. He was tall, well-groomed, the sort of man who looked entirely at home anywhere, perhaps too much so. His voice, when he spoke, carried an easy warmth that didn't quite reach his eyes. "My dear, you should be resting," he said to his wife, then turned toward the Beresfords. "Good morning. I'm Leonard Grant. My wife tells me you're private investigators, or is confidential agents the preferred term these days?" Tommy smiled pleasantly. "We answer to either, depending on who's paying the bill." Grant's lips curved in amusement. "Quite so. I'm afraid my wife has been overwrought. Some foolish letter, the sort of childish prank that occasionally finds its way into the post." Tuppence studied him while pretending to adjust her gloves. The charm was real, but behind it she sensed calculation, a subtle awareness of what to say, what to conceal. "If it's only a prank," she said mildly, "it's an unusually cruel one." Grant's expression hardened for a fraction of a second before recovering. "Indeed, but we mustn't let imagination turn shadows into monsters." Mrs. Grant's hands twisted the handkerchief in her lap. "It isn't imagination," she said softly. "The letter knows about Whitby. Leonard, you can't pretend that—" "Felicia!" His tone was sharp, and she flinched as if struck. The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Then Grant laughed lightly. "Forgive me. My wife has been unwell. I insist on protecting her from gossip, that's all." Tuppence moved to the mantel and with a deliberate gesture lifted the envelope from beneath the vase. "May I?" Grant hesitated. His wife gave a tiny nod. The letter was brief, one line in harsh, uneven script. "You will pay for what was done on Whitby Cliffs." No signature, no clue to its origin, save a faint aroma. Sharp, briny, unmistakably sea salt. Tuppence inhaled it, eyes narrowing. Curious. Not the sort of scent one picks up in Kensington. Tommy leaned closer. "And the paper's coarser than English stock. Imported, perhaps. Scandinavian?" Leonard Grant's smile never faltered, but his eyes cooled. "You have sharp noses as well as sharp wits. Unfortunately, that won't make this foolishness more credible. The police laughed at it, quite rightly." "The police have seen it?" Tuppence asked quickly. "I showed it to Inspector Markham at the station 2 streets over," Grant said smoothly, a little too smoothly, as if rehearsing the line for strangers. "He advised me to burn it. I preferred not to. Sentimentality, perhaps." Mrs. Grant's voice trembled. "He's lying. He never showed it to anyone. He said no one must know." Leonard's laugh was too bright. "My dear, you mustn't contradict me before guests." Tuppence's heart tightened at the small, helpless look Felicia gave her. She recognized it, the look of a woman cornered by charm that had turned to control. At that moment, the door opened a crack and a young woman peeked in, neat bobbed hair, typing smudges on her fingers, and an alertness that seemed out of place. "Oh, sorry, Mr. Grant, I didn't realize—" "Come in, Miss Calthorpe," he said. "My secretary, Mr. and Mrs. Beresford. She keeps my correspondence from swallowing me alive." Miss Calthorpe smiled quickly, but her eyes darted to the letter in Tuppence's hand with unmistakable curiosity. "I just came to ask if you needed the coastal files signed, sir." "Later," he said curtly. She nodded, but lingered a fraction too long before retreating. When the door closed, Tommy remarked lightly, "Efficient young lady. Knows her tides, I imagine." "Quite indispensable," Grant said smoothly. Mrs. Grant shivered. "She arrived only a month ago," she murmured almost to herself, "right after the first letter came." Tuppence caught the words but said nothing. Instead, she replaced the envelope and turned to Leonard Grant. "We'll need to keep the letter for a day or two, for analysis." "I'd rather you didn't," he said quickly. "My wife's nerves—" "It may calm her to know someone else is worrying on her behalf," Tommy interrupted. We'll handle it discreetly. Grant hesitated, then shrugged, the gesture of a man conceding the unimportant. Very well, if it must be so. They made polite farewells, Mrs. Grant's hand lingering in Tuppence's with desperate gratitude. As the front door closed behind them, the cold air hit like release. Tommy exhaled. Well, my sweet sleuth, what do you make of the Grants? Tuppence looked back at the drawn curtains. A house that keeps its eyes shut, a husband too smooth, a wife too frightened, and a secretary far too observant. I'd say we've stumbled into something tangled. Tommy nodded. And the sea salt scent? A clue worth bottling. Hollow Street may be inland, she murmured, but the tide's clearly come in for someone. The maid watched from the window as they walked away, her anxious face framed by the lace. Inside, the fire in the study hissed softly, as if something unseen had just been dropped into the flames. The morning after their visit to Hollow Street dawned with a reluctant pallor, the kind of London day that looked half-finished and rather sorry for itself. Fog still pressed close against the windows of the Beresfords' flat in South Audley Street, blurring the city into a watercolour of grey. Inside, the coal fire did its best to suggest domestic optimism, though even it crackled with a certain uncertainty. Tuppence sat at the breakfast table, stirring her coffee as though divination might rise from the cup. Tommy, in shirt-sleeves, was hunched over the newspaper, pencil in hand, and that faint, eager crease between his brows, which meant the hunt was officially on. "Found something?" she asked at last. He didn't answer immediately, tracing a column with the pencil's end. Then he looked up, eyes bright. "Possibly. Whitby Cliffs." The phrase rang a bell. "There's a wartime report here, 15 years old. Listen to this. Tragic death at Whitby. Courier missing after fall from cliffs believed carrying sensitive material. Authorities suspect smuggling ring or espionage connection." Tuppence's spoon paused mid-stir. "A courier? During the war?" He nodded. "A woman, according to the continuation. Name withheld at the time, apparently classified. But that business of espionage fits too neatly with our friend Grant's generation, doesn't it? He would have been in military supply back then." She frowned. And Felicia Grant's nerves could have more to do with guilt than fright, a past secret resurfacing. Still, why the letter now? "Someone who remembers," Tommy said. "Someone with unfinished business." He folded the paper carefully as if it were evidence. "We'll need background, where Leonard Grant was stationed during the war. If we can confirm Whitby, we'll be halfway to the motive." Tuppence rose, smoothing her skirt. "Then we start with the post office. Every letter leaves a trail, darling, even anonymous ones." By late morning, the fog had begun to lift into a pale, watery sunlight. The Beresfords boarded a tram rattling east toward the river, its windows smeared with condensation. Outside, London shuffled through its day, bootblacks, paper sellers, and the hum of traffic softened by the damp air. They alighted near Charing Cross and ducked into a narrow cafe tucked between a tobacconist and a chemist's. The sign above the door read Barker's Tea Rooms, Esther 1898, and it smelled agreeably of burnt toast and cheap tobacco. Inside, an elderly man in a green visor presided over a tiny postal counter at the back, polishing spectacles with the solemnity of ritual. The rest of the cafe murmured around them, clerks reading the Times, women gossiping over scones, a radio crooning something sentimental. Tommy approached the counter with his most amiable smile. "Good morning. We're doing a bit of private research, historical, nothing official, and hoped you might help us." The postmaster eyed him over his glasses. "Historical, eh? Not about the government, I trust?" "Only the ghosts of it," Tommy said lightly. "We're looking into an old wartime posting, Mr. Leonard Grant. Do you happen to recall if he ever served in Yorkshire, around Whitby?" The man pursed his lips, thinking. "Grant? Yes, I might. Had a head like a lantern, always polished shoes. Worked as an assistant quartermaster, I believe. Stayed a few months up north. Then there was a business. Something unpleasant. Word went round." "What kind of business?" Tuppence asked gently. He leaned closer, lowering his voice as though the dead might overhear. "A woman went off the cliffs. Some said accident. Others said she carried papers not her own. There was a hush, of course. Things like that didn't reach the papers proper. Too much embarrassment for the ministry. But I remember the initials. They were all anyone dared whisper. A.G. Tuppence's pulse gave a quick leap. "A.G.? That's right. The old man nodded. Never knew her full name. They said she'd been seen quarrelling with someone the night before she fell. A tall fellow, wore naval boots. Then she was gone, only her handbag washed up. Tommy exchanged a look with Tuppence. "Thank you, that's most helpful. You've the memory of an archivist." The man chuckled, pocketing his polishing cloth. "Old habits. We kept records when records were worth something. You'll be wanting the Whitby Gazette archives if you're serious. But take care, sir. Some stones best left unturned. They're damp underneath." Tuppence smiled. "We're quite accustomed to damp stones." They left him with thanks and a few coins for his trouble, stepping back into the street where the fog had turned faintly golden. "Initials A.G., Tommy repeated as they walked. "And Felicia Grant's maiden name is Allardyce, Felicia Allardyce Grant. A coincidence, perhaps, but the universe doesn't usually waste good initials." "Nor does it send letters scented with sea air," Tuppence said. "If A.G. was a courier, and Leonard had anything to do with her fall, someone has kept that story waiting for an audience." Tommy gave a short laugh. Then Hollow Street's curtain call is finally beginning. They crossed toward the embankment, the Thames rolling sluggishly below, carrying fog and coal dust with its eternal patience. A newsboy shouted headlines. A bus groaned past, spraying puddles across the pavement. The city itself seemed to eavesdrop. As they walked, Tuppence's thoughts turned inward. She remembered Felicia Grant's fragile composure, the way her husband's presence had silenced her like a closing door. If the anonymous letter had stirred an old guilt, perhaps the fear wasn't of exposure, but of recognition. A.G., the courier, could have been more than a stranger. She stopped abruptly. "Tommy, suppose A.G. wasn't just a courier, but a relation, someone Felicia knew personally. What if Leonard used that connection during the war?" He regarded her with approval. "Always ahead of the script, Tuppence. You're suggesting emotional leverage, a choice forced upon her." "Exactly. You will pay for what was done on Whitby Cliffs. The letter accuses, but the guilt might belong to more than one person." Tommy frowned. "Then we'll need to find who else was stationed with Grant. If the name surfaces again, we'll know this isn't mere coincidence." That afternoon found them at the reading room of the Daily Mail archives, a world of dust, quiet footsteps, and pages that smelled of forgotten ink. Tommy handled the microfilm with the cautious respect of a man defusing a bomb, while Tuppence read aloud from the dim projector light. "Listen to this. Coastal tragedy at Whitby. Female body unrecovered, believed lost to sea. Authorities deny rumours of espionage activity." She leaned closer. "There's a follow-up a week later. Witness describes quarrel between the deceased and unidentified man prior to disappearance. No names, naturally." "Still," Tommy mused, "the pattern holds. Secret courier, possible betrayal, a cliff and silence ordered from above, and now a letter reviving it all." Tuppence sat back, rubbing her temples. 15 years ago. Whoever wrote that letter must have been close enough to know the truth. The question is, did Felicia Grant play victim or accomplice? "Or both," Tommy said. "There's an art to being both." They packed up their notes and stepped once more into the mist-soft evening. The city hummed around them, tram bells, footsteps, the distant rumble of trains heading north. Tuppence paused at the bridge, gazing at the water's shifting light. "Funny, isn't it? London always feels solid, yet every secret eventually floats to the surface, like driftwood from another shore." Tommy slipped a hand through her arm, "and it usually bumps against us first. Come on, we'll cable Whitby for confirmation of Grant's assignment. If he was there during that accident, we'll have our anchor." As they turned homeward, a gust carried the briny tang of the river. For a moment, the scent was unmistakable, salt and memory. Tuppence shivered. Tommy noticed. "Cold?" "Not exactly," she murmured. "Just a feeling, as if something from those cliffs has followed us back, waiting for recognition." Behind them, the fog curled along the embankment railings like pale fingers reaching inland from the sea. By the time Thursday's grey afternoon dissolved into evening drizzle, Tommy Beresford had checked his watch 4 times and rearranged the same 3 papers on his desk, at least 10. Miss Eleanor Vale was supposed to have arrived at 6. It was now nearly 7:30, and the tea tray Albert had left cooling on the sideboard looked as dispirited as Tommy felt. Tuppence crossed from the window, where the lamplit street below gleamed like a river of tarnished silver. "You're fretting," she said. "I never fret," Tommy replied, though his tone contradicted him. "I merely contemplate. There's a distinction." "She's not coming," Tuppence said gently, "and you know it." Tommy sighed. "Yes, I suppose I do." The rain deepened its rhythm against the panes, a steady whisper like secrecy itself. Somewhere in the distance, thunder murmured over the rooftops, that low, uncertain growl which announces more to come. Tuppence stood still for a moment, then reached for her coat. "If she hasn't come to us, we'll go to her. You have her address?" Tommy was already on his feet, the restless energy of the chase replacing disappointment. "Of course I have it. Let's hope the landlady's fonder of conversation than rent." Miss Eleanor Vale's lodgings occupied the upper floor of a narrow house on Cromwell Road, a building whose best days had deserted it some time after the armistice. The brass numbers were green with neglect, and the hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and anxiety. The landlady, a heavy-shouldered woman with a suspicious stare, opened the door only as wide as propriety demanded. "Miss Vale?" Tommy asked, flashing his most reassuring smile. "Gone," the woman said flatly. "Gone where?" Tuppence asked. "Didn't say. Paid through Friday, left Tuesday night. Quiet girl, too quiet. I went up next morning to see if she'd forgotten anything. Found the place in a right mess. Papers torn, drawers open, trunk empty. No forwarding address, no nothing." She wiped her hands on her apron. "If you ask me, she did a bunk. Girls do sometimes when they've got themselves into trouble." "Or when someone else has," Tuppence murmured. "Mind if we have a look at her room?" Tommy asked. The woman hesitated, then shrugged. "If you think you'll find her ghost, be my guest. Second floor, first door on the right." The room bore the unmistakable air of flight. Drawers gaping like mouths mid-confession, a few articles of clothing left behind in haste, and the faint perfume of cheap violets that clung to the curtains. Tuppence moved carefully, her eyes scanning with the precision of instinct. "Look at this," she said, stooping to pick up a torn envelope. The name on it had been half burned, but one corner still showed the printed crest of Hollow Street. "From the Grants," Tommy said. So she was still in contact. He lifted a scrap of charred paper from the grate, what remained of a photograph, scorched along one side. Against the surviving half of glossy surface, the sea curved in a pale horizon, and two figures stood on a cliff edge. One was unmistakably Leonard Grant, the other a woman in a white dress with her face turned away. Tuppence studied it silently. "Whitby," she said at last. "It must be. The sea looks northern, cold, grey and guilty." Tommy turned the fragment over. "No writing, but this wasn't burned long ago. The edges are still clean. Someone wanted it destroyed in a hurry." He dropped it into an envelope from his pocket. "We'll keep this for later." Tuppence had crossed to the wardrobe and was examining the floorboards. "Come here," she said softly. Beneath the edge of a rug lay a scrap of torn fabric, plain navy wool. Part of her coat hem, perhaps, caught and ripped. She left quickly, yes, but not voluntarily. Tommy frowned. "You mean—" "I mean she may not have left at all under her own arrangements. Someone searched this room after she did, or while she couldn't stop them." Thunder rolled again, nearer now. The window shuddered in its frame as lightning flashed white across the opposite rooftops. They stood in the dimness, the moment caught between suspicion and dread. The next morning, under a sky still bruised from the storm, they returned to number 12 Hollow Street. The maid who opened the door looked even paler than before. "Oh, it's you again," she said quickly, and then dropped her voice. "Best come in quiet. Mrs. Grant's poorly this morning." Inside, the air smelled of camphor and fear. The curtains remained drawn, muting daylight into sickly shadow. Felicia Grant was in the drawing room, propped against a pile of cushions, her face a fragile portrait of distress. She started visibly when she saw them. "Mrs. Beresford, Mr. Beresford, what has happened? Why are you here?" Tuppence sat beside her, taking the woman's cold hand. "We came hoping to see Miss Vale. She hasn't been home since Tuesday." Felicia's fingers tightened convulsively. "Eleanor? Gone?" "Yes," Tommy said. "Her room was found in disorder. Do you know where she might have gone?" Felicia's lips trembled. No, she promised she would come today." She broke off, a sudden whiteness flooding her face. Her body sagged back against the cushions. "Tommy!" Tuppence cried. He caught Mrs. Grant before she slipped to the floor. The maid hurried in with smelling salts wringing her hands. "She's had spells like this since yesterday, sir. Dr. Marston says it's nerves." When Felicia opened her eyes again, her voice was barely a whisper. "It's my fault. I told her too much. I shouldn't have. Oh, Leonard will be furious." The door opened abruptly. Leonard Grant filled the doorway, his presence sudden and oppressive. "What's this?" His voice was sharp. "Felicia? Again?" Tommy straightened. "Mrs. Grant was alarmed by Miss Vale's disappearance. We thought you might have heard from her." Leonard's gaze flickered, then steadied with forced calm. "Eleanor Vale was a highly nervous young woman. I dismissed her yesterday morning. Too much imagination, too many hysterics. Likely she's run home to her family." "She gave no indication of dismissal when she came to us," Tuppence said evenly. He smiled thinly. "She may have exaggerated her importance. Governesses sometimes do." Tuppence rose, her tone polite but edged. "And yet she seemed devoted to your wife's welfare." Leonard's smile faltered. "Devotion takes many forms. In her case, perhaps unhealthy ones." Felicia closed her eyes again as if the sound of his voice was too much to bear. Tommy felt the weight of the man's control hanging in the air, smooth, reasonable, suffocating. Before they left, Tuppence asked to see the study again. Grant hesitated, then agreed with visible irritation. "If it will satisfy you. But do be quick. I've business." The study smelled faintly of tobacco and polish. It was tidy, almost aggressively so. Papers in perfect alignment, not a trace of domestic life, except for a single seashell on the mantelpiece, small and pink, gleaming faintly in the lamplight. "Interesting ornament," Tommy murmured. "My wife's," Grant said curtly. "She collects nonsense." But when he left them alone a few moments later, Tuppence knelt to inspect the floor near the desk. Something pale glimmered beneath the carpet edge. She lifted it delicately. It was a child's bracelet, made of tiny seashells strung together with faded thread, the kind sold on northern seaside promenades. Tommy bent low. "That doesn't belong here." "No," Tuppence whispered. "And it was hidden, tucked just under the carpet. Felicia doesn't strike me as someone who crawls about the floor arranging trinkets." They exchanged a glance heavy with unspoken thought. A child's bracelet, a letter scented with the sea, a photograph burned to half a memory. Tuppence replaced the carpet carefully. "Whatever happened at Whitby wasn't only about secrets," she said. "It was about someone lost, someone whose memory refuses to stay buried." As they stepped back into the hall, the maid appeared again, eyes darting nervously. "Please, don't tell Mr. Grant I spoke, but he's been taking telephone calls late at night. Once I heard him say, 'I warned you,' before he slammed it down. And last night—" She broke off, blanching. "There, that's him now." The telephone was ringing in the study, sharp, insistent, impatient. Grant's voice echoed from within. "Yes? Yes, I told you never." Then silence. Tuppence and Tommy slipped out before the door reopened. Outside, thunder cracked across the sky, rolling over the rooftops like the sound of judgment deferred. Tuppence drew her coat tighter, her face pale in the flickering light. "He's covering something, but not only for himself. That bracelet, the letter, the photograph. Someone is moving in the shadows, Tommy. Someone who knows what really happened." Tommy looked up at the heavy clouds, dark and swollen with rain. "Then we'd best keep our lamps trimmed. When that storm breaks, I'd wager Hollow Street won't be the only thing struck by lightning." Behind them, the house at number 12 stood mute, its windows dark, its curtains drawn tighter than ever, as if it already feared what the next flash of light might reveal. Fog had rolled up from the river like something summoned, thick and cold and strangely alive. It muffled the world, swallowing sound until even footsteps seemed shy of being heard. Lamps burned like pale coins suspended in the air, their light barely reaching the slick cobblestones below. Tommy Beresford drew his collar higher and peered through the mist toward the wharves. "I must say, Tuppence, you do pick the most romantic locations. Dinner at the Savoy one night, an assignation with a sailor in the fog the next." Tuppence, her gloved hand tight on her umbrella, gave him a sharp look. "He telephoned the office himself, Tommy. Said he had something to tell us. Something about Whitby. You'd think you'd be grateful someone's volunteering to solve your mystery for you." "Grateful, yes. Convinced, no," Tommy murmured. In my experience, men who know too much usually end up knowing too little after someone hits them. A bell sounded somewhere far out on the water, long and mournful. The air smelled of rope, tar, and old tides. Somewhere a barge creaked, invisible in the whiteness. The voice that called to them came out of the mist without warning. "Mr. Beresford, over here!" They turned sharply. A figure stepped out of shadow, a stocky man in a worn navy peacoat and cap pulled low. He had a face like a weathered map, and eyes that darted from fog to lamplight and back again. "Jack Marney?" Tuppence asked. He nodded warily. "That's right, miss. You'll want to hear what I've got. Not here, though. Walls have ears in this fog. Come closer to the shed, if you please." He led them a few paces along the quay to a narrow alley between warehouses. The boards beneath their feet were slick with river damp, and the reek of the Thames rose up in clammy gusts. Tommy's instincts prickled. "All right, Marnie, you said you knew about Whitby. What's the connection to the Grants?" The man rubbed his hands together nervously. "Knew a man up there, years ago. Worked the supply boats. Name a Grant. Same eyes, same way of talking like he's already won the argument. And there was a woman, always waiting on the cliff path, shawl about her shoulders. They said she'd been promised marriage, but he left her with nothing but his photograph." Tuppence's eyes sharpened. "Anna Gray?" Marnie nodded once. "That's the name, Anna Gray. But there's something else you ought to know." He broke off suddenly, head jerking up. Somewhere behind them, a faint scuffing sound came from the mist. Soft, deliberate, too close. Tommy spun around, hand going instinctively to his coat pocket. "Who's there?" No answer. Only fog and the dim orange halo of the nearest lamp. Marnie swallowed. "We're not alone." The next sound was a rush, footsteps pounding on wet boards, and then chaos. A figure burst from the fog, striking Marnie full in the chest. The sailor cried out, stumbled back, and went down hard. The attacker turned, vanishing into the mist as swiftly as he'd come. Tommy was already after him, running blind through the vapour. "Stop! Confound it, stop!" The fog swallowed everything. Sound, sight, even direction. He caught the faint flash of movement ahead, a coat flaring, a glint of buttons, and then, fleetingly, the unmistakable outline of a slim figure in a governess's coat, the hem swinging, a small hat pinned tight. "Eleanor!" he shouted. But the shape was gone. Only the echo of his own voice answered him, hollow in the fog. Back at the quay, Tuppence was kneeling beside Marnie. His face was white, a dark patch spreading beneath his collar. The attack had been fast, a knife, she thought, judging by the clean rip through the fabric. "Hold on," she said, pressing a handkerchief to the wound. "Help is coming." Marnie's eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "Did you see her?" he whispered. "Her?" Tuppence leaned close. "Who?" "The woman. She's not dead. The one who fell." He coughed, a thin, wet sound. "Wasn't meant to die. Wrong one. Wrong one. Who wasn't meant?" But the question dissolved with his breath. The sailor's head dropped sideways, his face settling into the awful stillness of release. Tommy came back a moment later, breathing hard, his overcoat streaked with mist. "Lost her, or whoever it was. Gone like smoke." Tuppence looked up grimly. "He's dead." Tommy removed his hat, standing silent for a moment as the fog eddied around them. "Did he say anything?" She nodded slowly. "The one who fell wasn't meant to die." Tommy let out a long breath. "That's comforting." Tuppence glanced down at the man's still form. He was frightened, Tommy, not just of being followed, but of something already decided. Whoever killed him knew he'd talk tonight. Tommy's gaze swept the wharf, and wore a governess's coat. Either Eleanor's alive, or someone wants us to think she is. A constable's whistle shrilled distantly. Within minutes the scene filled with the slow chaos of investigation, policemen appearing from the fog like conjured shapes, their torches cutting white tunnels through the murk. A sergeant took their names and statements, his notebook damp and curling in the mist. "Looks like robbery gone wrong," he said gruffly, bending over the body. Tuppence met Tommy's eyes. Neither spoke. They'd both seen the clean, deliberate wound, and robbery had nothing to do with it. An hour later, they found brief refuge in a dockside cafe that stayed open for sailors and policemen alike. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of strong tea. Tommy sat opposite Tuppence at a rickety table, frowning over the small evidence envelope she'd retrieved from Marnie's pocket. Inside lay a single object, a ferry ticket, worn and creased, dated 2 days after Eleanor Vale's supposed disappearance. Tuppence's fingers lingered on the printed date. 2 days? She was meant to have vanished Tuesday night, yet this was purchased Thursday. From Whitby to London, Tommy said. So she went back north, or someone used her name to come south. Either way, she was alive then. She could be now, Tuppence said quietly. Marnie's killer, if it was her, might have acted in panic. But if someone merely wore her coat... Tommy leaned back, considering. Leonard Grant dismissed her, claims she was unstable. Then a sailor connected to him ends up dead hours after speaking with us. It's a neat circle, and I dislike neat circles. Outside, the fog thickened again, pressing against the cafe windows like damp hands. Somewhere beyond the murk, a ship's horn bellowed, deep, sorrowful. Tuppence stirred her tea absently. Do you think Felicia Grant knows her husband's past in full? Knows it, perhaps. Admits it? Never. She's the kind who protects with silence, and that silence may be the one thing keeping her alive. A waiter shuffled over with the bill, eyeing the ticket curiously before retreating. The Beresfords sat in thoughtful quiet until Tommy spoke again, voice lower. You heard Marnie's words. The one who fell wasn't meant to die. Suppose Whitby's accident wasn't an accident at all, but a mistake. Someone else was supposed to go over those cliffs. Tuppence looked up sharply. You mean Anna Gray wasn't the intended victim? Possibly. If Leonard Grant meant to rid himself of a witness or a spy, the wrong woman might have paid the price. And if that's true, Tuppence murmured, then the letter, you will pay for what was done, comes from whoever still grieves for her. She folded the ferry ticket carefully, her eyes distant. We've been looking for a blackmailer, Tommy, but perhaps we've been chasing an avenger. By the time they reached their flat, the city was nearly asleep. The fog had lifted slightly, though wisps still trailed like ghosts along the lamplight. Fritz, immaculate even at midnight, met them at the door. A telegram arrived, sir, he said, handing it over. Tommy tore it open. The message was unsigned. The sea keeps what it takes, but not always. Look beneath what burns. Tuppence stared at it. Look beneath what burns. Tommy, the photograph Eleanor tried to destroy. Half burned, he said slowly. But the reverse was clean. If she meant to erase faces, why leave that one intact? The thunder that had rumbled the previous night growled again in the distance, promising another storm. Tuppence's voice was quiet but steady. She found something, a truth hidden in the ashes, and someone made sure she'd never tell it. Tommy nodded. Then tomorrow we dig through ashes and see what the sea left behind. The rain had finally given up its siege by the time evening came, leaving London washed and gleaming under a weak, uncertain moon. Hollow Street lay in uneasy silence, a cul-de-sac of forgotten elegance, its windows dark, its lamplight blurred in puddles. Tommy Beresford stood in the shadow of an elm tree, collar turned up, peering across the narrow road toward number 12. You're sure they've gone? He murmured. Tuppence beside him adjusted her hat with calm assurance. Mrs. Grant's maid told me they were invited to a dinner party at Kensington Court. The maid herself is off to see her aunt in Paddington, which leaves us with a golden window of opportunity. Tommy exhaled. You make it sound delightfully respectable, as if we were calling for tea instead of breaking and entering. Please, darling, she said sweetly. We're not breaking anything, merely entering with purpose. He chuckled softly. A comfort to the magistrate, no doubt. The front gate creaked faintly as they slipped inside. Number 12 loomed above them, the same drawn curtains, the same heavy quiet. But tonight it felt different, expectant, watching. Tuppence produced a small key she had borrowed earlier from the unsuspecting maid's keyring. The lock yielded with a soft click. Inside, the air held the chill of a house that did not welcome strangers. The faint smell of polish and old smoke lingered, layered over something else, secrecy perhaps, or fear. Lights? Tommy whispered. None. Torch only. Tuppence switched on the narrow beam. The hallway sprang to life. Paintings glimmered. A clock ticked like a guilty conscience, and their footsteps whispered across the rug. They paused outside the study door. "This is where you noticed the difference?" Tommy asked. Tuppence nodded. "Yesterday morning that rug was flush against the skirting. Now it's crooked by an inch, and the hearth has a faint scorch mark that wasn't there before." Tommy crouched, running a hand lightly over the carpet's edge. A man who leaves marks on his own hearth either drinks heavily or hides things badly. Leonard Grant doesn't strike me as the drinking kind. "No," Tuppence agreed. "He prefers control, which makes any mistake worth investigating." Tommy closed the door softly behind them. The room was thick with shadow, the faint outline of the desk, the gleam of brass on the fireplace tools, the ghost of smoke that never quite left the chimney. Tuppence swept her torch beam across the carpet. "There," she said quietly. "See the irregular patch, slightly darker." He knelt beside it. "Heavy traffic here recently. And look, the hearth tiles are uneven." He tapped one lightly with the handle of his penknife. A dull sound, then another, hollow beneath. Tommy raised an eyebrow. "Well, well, shall we?" Tuppence smiled faintly. "By all means, Professor." He slid the knife's tip under the edge of the tile. It resisted, then shifted with a reluctant scrape. Beneath it lay a thin panel of wood, scorched at one corner, and under that, darkness. Tommy reached into the space carefully and drew out a small metal box blackened by age. A faint smell of ash clung to it. "Someone tried to burn this," he murmured, "but lost their nerve before it finished." Tuppence's heartbeat quickened. "Open it." He did. Inside lay an old leather-bound book, edges singed, cover cracked. The initials F.G. were faintly embossed on the corner. Tuppence reached out reverently, fingertips brushing the brittle pages. Felicia Grant. Tommy's torchlight caught the ink, faded and brown. The first entry bore the date March 1918. March 3rd. "The sea is cruel. It takes and gives back only fragments. Leonard says it was necessary, that she was careless, that I must not think of it again. But how can I not, when every wave seems to whisper her name? A reckless choice, he called it. My choice. But it was his hand that pointed." Tuppence read the words aloud softly, her voice echoing faintly in the stillness. Tommy leaned over her shoulder. So she knew. She was involved somehow. The next pages were filled with short, halting entries, fragments of confession, mentions of a messenger, of papers lost at sea, of fear that the wrong person had died. One passage stood out, the ink darker, the handwriting jagged. April 9th. "The child cried again tonight. I told her it was the wind, but she knows more than I think. Leonard says she is not ours to keep if she becomes a danger. He frightens me when he speaks so. I will hide what I must, for her sake and for mine." Tuppence glanced toward the hearth, remembering the little seashell bracelet hidden beneath the rug, proof that the house had once held a child and that its ghosts were flesh before they were legend. Tuppence felt a chill run down her spine. "The child?" she murmured. "A child in the house, and this was written years ago." Tommy nodded grimly. If it was Anna Gray's child, or connected somehow, it explains Felicia's terror. She's been living with a secret that could destroy them both. He turned to the final entry. It was brief, just 4 words written across the page, like a cry frozen in ink. "He made me choose." The silence afterward was almost reverent. Only the faint ticking of the mantel clock disturbed it. Tuppence closed the book carefully, as though afraid to disturb the dead. "Felicia Grant wasn't the blackmailer," she said at last. "She's the victim." Tommy glanced toward the hearth. "Then who is? Leonard? Or someone who knows what she chose? And how?" Tuppence rose, pacing slowly. Perhaps Eleanor Vale discovered this journal. If she confronted Leonard, she'd have been silenced, Tommy finished quietly, like Marnie. They stood in thoughtful stillness, the air thick with the weight of revelation. Then Tuppence moved the beam of the torch toward the mantel. Something glimmered there, a faint petal shape, flattened between glass and frame. She reached up, unhooking a small decorative frame. Inside the glass, pressed and preserved, lay a single flower, fragile, yellowed with age. Beneath it, in faded ink, 2 words were written, Whitby, 1918. Tommy let out a low whistle. A souvenir or a memorial? Both, Tuppence said. It's the same flower pressed between the last pages of the journal. She slid open the frame, revealing the flower's delicate stem. Beneath it, folded and almost invisible, was a strip of paper. She eased it free. It was a letter fragment, scorched along one edge, the writing faint but legible. If ever truth is asked of you, remember, it was not the sea that took her. Tommy's eyes narrowed. That settles it. Anna Gray didn't fall, she was pushed, or made to fall, and Leonard Grant was there. And Felicia knew, Tuppence whispered. She's lived all these years knowing her husband killed a woman and let her carry the guilt. Tommy replaced the frame carefully, which makes her letter from the blackmailer all the more cruel. Someone's twisting the knife, not to expose Leonard, but to break Felicia. He glanced around the room. Let's put things back before the Grants return. I'd rather not explain our archaeology under oath. They restored the box beneath the hearth, aligning the tiles as precisely as before. Tuppence smoothed the rug's edge, leaving the faintest trace of their intrusion erased. When they stepped out into the hall, the house seemed to sigh, as if relieved to have confessed. Tuppence paused at the threshold. "Tommy," she said softly, "what if the blackmailer isn't Leonard at all? What if it's Eleanor, or someone pretending to be her? Someone using the journal's words against them?" Tommy locked the door behind them. Possible, but Eleanor's cleverer than that. If she were alive, she wouldn't risk exposure without proof, and if she's dead, someone's using her as a ghost. They slipped out into the night, pulling the gate quietly behind them. The street lay empty, pale under a hesitant moon. The sound of a distant cab echoed faintly, then faded. Halfway down the lane, Tuppence stopped abruptly. "Wait." Tommy turned. "What is it?" "The light," she whispered. "In the upstairs window. It wasn't on before." He followed her gaze. A dim glow had appeared behind the lace curtains of number 12, and a flicker, faint but steady, as though someone had returned unexpectedly. Tommy took her arm. "Come on." They crossed the street swiftly and ducked behind the low garden wall. The light moved, once, twice, and then vanished. "Someone's in the study," Tuppence breathed. "Or was," Tommy said grimly. "We can't risk another break-in. Let's get back before we join the missing list." They retraced their steps quickly, the night closing behind them. From far away came the roll of thunder, faint but certain, echoing across the rooftops. When they reached the corner, Tuppence glanced back one last time. The house stood dark again, silent, but she could not shake the impression of eyes watching from behind those curtains, patient, deliberate, and knowing. As they turned away, she spoke quietly. "He made me choose." That's what Felicia wrote. Whatever happened at Whitby, whatever began with a reckless choice, it's still demanding payment. Tommy offered a faint smile, though his eyes were thoughtful. "Then let's make sure we're the ones sending the bill." The morning broke uncertainly, as if the sun itself hesitated to commit to shining. A low mist hung over London, softening corners, swallowing distance, and blurring the line between truth and illusion. Fitting weather, Tommy Beresford thought, for what they were about to do. He and Tuppence stood once more before number 12, Hollow Street, the house that now seemed to breathe its own secrets. The brass knocker was dull, the curtains drawn, but smoke coiled faintly from the chimney, a sign of life, or perhaps of something trying to disguise itself as such. Tommy cast a sideways glance at his wife. "Ready?" "As I'll ever be," Tuppence murmured. "But I should warn you, Tommy, women like Felicia Grant rarely tell the whole truth at once. You have to dig gently, or the ground collapses under you." Tommy smiled faintly. "Then I'll follow your lead, as usual." They rang. This time the maid who answered looked so pale that she seemed carved from wax. Her hands twisted nervously in her apron. "Mrs. Grant is in the drawing-room," she whispered. "She said she expected you." Expected. That word always troubled Tommy. Expectation meant preparation, and preparation meant someone had been thinking far ahead of them. The drawing-room was much as before, heavy curtains, polished wood, and the faint perfume of lilac overlaying the more human scent of anxiety. A fire glowed fitfully in the grate, its flames darting nervously, throwing small, restless reflections on the brass fender. Felicia Grant sat by the hearth, her posture too perfect to be comfortable. A shawl draped about her shoulders could not disguise the frailty of her frame. When she looked up, her eyes were red-rimmed, her voice thin. "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, I wondered how long it would take before you came back." Tuppence set her gloves neatly on the table beside her. "We wouldn't have troubled you, Mrs. Grant, but there are matters that can't be postponed. It's about the letters, and Miss Vale." Felicia's hand trembled slightly, tightening on the edge of the chair. "Eleanor Vale," she said slowly, as though tasting the name for the first time. "Yes, Leonard told me about her disappearance. Shocking, of course, but I hardly knew the girl. She was with us only a few weeks." "You never met her before?" Tommy asked. Her answer came too quickly. "No, never." Tuppence tilted her head. "She claimed to be your governess, yet she came to us terrified, certain that something dreadful would happen here. She spoke of a letter accusing your husband of a crime at Whitby." Felicia's face went still. For a moment, only the ticking of the clock filled the silence. Then, with a visible effort, she whispered, "Yes, the letter. I burned the first one, but others followed. The words were always the same. You will pay for what was done on Whitby Cliffs." Her voice cracked. "You must think me a coward. I've tried so hard to forget, but it doesn't forget me." Tuppence moved closer, her tone gentler now. "Sometimes forgetting isn't mercy, Mrs. Grant. Sometimes it's punishment in disguise." Felicia's eyes glistened. "You don't understand. I was young, 21. The war had made fools of all of us. Leonard was clever, ambitious. He said he worked in intelligence, that there were traitors in our ranks. One of them was a woman, a courier carrying messages for the Germans." She paused, her fingers trembling at her throat. "They found her, or thought they had, but she claimed innocence. They needed someone to confirm her identity. Leonard said he'd seen her before, but they wanted corroboration. He begged me to say I'd seen her too, to swear she was the one. I refused at first, but then—" Her breath came unevenly, her next words barely audible. "My brother was in trouble. A foolish boy, caught selling army petrol to smugglers. Leonard said if I helped him, the charges would vanish. If not, my brother would face prison, or worse." The fire crackled sharply, throwing a brief flare of light across her face. "So, you did it," Tuppence said softly. Felicia's eyes filled with tears. "I said yes. I told them the woman was the courier. She was executed 3 days later, but she wasn't guilty. I found out afterward. She was a nurse passing letters for soldiers, nothing more. Her name was Anna Gray." The name hung in the air like a curse. Tommy exhaled slowly. "Anna Gray. The initials we found carved into the back of your journal." Felicia's head snapped up. "My journal?" He nodded. "Yes, hidden under your hearth. You signed each entry FG, the last one ended with 4 words. He made me choose." For a moment she stared at him, stricken. Then the tears came, quietly at first, then in waves that shook her frail shoulders. "It's true," she whispered. "He did. Leonard made me choose between my brother's life and a stranger's death, and I chose wrong." Tuppence reached for a handkerchief, pressing it gently into her hand. "And now someone knows, someone who wants to make you relive it." Felicia nodded, her voice barely a breath. "That letter was the first, but there have been others. They come without warning. Sometimes they arrive already open, as if Leonard has read them first. I ask him, but he laughs and calls it nonsense." Tommy frowned. "Yet, you never thought to destroy the journal." "I tried," Felicia said. "I burned some pages, but I couldn't bear to finish. It was the only place I told the truth, the only thing that belonged to me." She looked up suddenly, fear dawning behind her exhaustion. "You mustn't tell Leonard you found it. Promise me. He'd do anything to keep the past buried." Tuppence hesitated. "Mrs. Grant, there's something else you should know. Miss Vale may not be dead." Felicia froze. "Not dead?" "She may be alive," Tommy said. "Or someone is impersonating her. The night we met a sailor who claimed to know your husband's secret, he was attacked. We saw his assailant, a figure in a governess's coat. Either Eleanor survived and is playing a dangerous game, or someone wants us to believe she's haunting you from the fog." Felicia's face went white. "Then it's beginning again," she whispered. "Just as before, the warnings, the fear, the shadows watching. It's her revenge." "Whose?" Tuppence asked gently. Anna Gray's, Felicia said simply, or someone carrying her vengeance. For a moment, only the fire spoke, the occasional pop of sap, the slow collapse of a log. Then Tommy leaned forward, voice steady. Mrs. Grant, one last question. During the war, did you ever meet Anna Gray's family? Felicia shook her head. Never. Leonard told me she had no one, an orphan. Why? Because Miss Vale's papers, the ones we saw, listed her birthplace as Whitby. Felicia's expression changed. Confusion flickered, then dawning horror. Whitby, she repeated. That can't be. Can't it? Tuppence's tone was soft but relentless. Eleanor Vale, Anna Gray, initials reversed. You see what I'm suggesting. Felicia rose unsteadily, gripping the back of the chair. You mean she's her daughter? No, that's impossible. Leonard would have known. Tommy stood too. Would he? Or would he have hidden it the moment he recognized the resemblance? Felicia pressed a hand to her chest. Then that's why she came. That's why she looked at him the way she did. I thought it was fear, but it was recognition. The fire flared, throwing her shadow long against the wall. Tuppence spoke quietly. Mrs. Grant, you aren't the target. The letter wasn't vengeance on you. It was bait. Whoever wrote it wanted to draw Leonard out, to make him confess. Felicia's composure began to crumble again. You don't know him. He'll never confess. He'll deny, twist, threaten. She stopped abruptly, glancing toward the door. Please, you must go. He'll be home soon. Before we do, Tommy said, we need your help. The next time a letter arrives, don't destroy it. Keep it hidden. We'll be watching. Felicia's voice trembled. What will you do? Find the writer, Tuppence said simply, and make sure the right person pays for what was done on Whitby Cliffs. Felicia's gaze dropped to the flames. There's no right person anymore, she said dully. Only ghosts. They left her standing by the fire, her shawl trailing like smoke. Outside, the mist had thickened, softening the lamps into pale halos. Tommy walked in silence for a long while before speaking. Well, there it is. Confession complete. She identified Anna Gray, condemned an innocent woman, but Leonard pulled the strings, the whole business of choice. That's what's been haunting her. And yet, Tuppence said thoughtfully, it doesn't answer the question that matters. Which is? Why now? 15 years is a long time for vengeance to ripen, and whoever sent those letters knew details too precise to come from guesswork. They've read the journal, or they've heard it from someone who did. Tommy frowned. Leonard again. Perhaps, but I don't think he'd torment his wife for amusement. No, this is personal. Someone who knew Anna Gray. Someone who wants Leonard to face justice the way she never did. They turned the corner into the main road. A gust of wind lifted Tuppence's scarf, carrying with it a faint, sharp scent, sea salt. Unmistakable even here among the city's smoke. Tommy noticed it too. Sea air in London. Not possible, she said softly. Then, after a pause, unless the past really is blowing back from the coast. They walked on in silence, the street lamps fading behind them. Somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled, deep, solemn, echoing through fog and time alike. Tuppence spoke almost to herself. He made me choose. That was her confession. But what if Leonard's choice is still waiting to be made? Tommy's eyes narrowed. And whoever sent that letter intends to make him take it. A cab rumbled by, scattering the mist in its wake. Behind them, unseen, the curtain at number 12 stirred, just slightly, as though someone inside had been standing there all along, listening. The North Sea greeted Tuppence Beresford with a voice that was half lament, half warning. Wind whipped her hat ribbons into wild rebellion as she stepped off the train at Whitby Station, the salty air biting with memory. The town sloped before her in muted greys and blues, weathered cottages clinging to the hillside, gulls wheeling in lonely protest, and the abbey ruins standing dark against the winter sky like a conscience carved in stone. Whitby, where everything had begun. She had come alone this time, leaving Tommy in London to handle what he called loose ends, though Tuppence suspected those ends were more likely to try strangling him. The journal's last entries had drawn her here, to the coast that still whispered the name Anna Gray. She hailed a cab, a rickety vehicle whose engine sounded like an elderly dog clearing its throat, and gave the driver an address from memory. The Anchor's Rest, she said. The driver nodded. Mrs. Harker's place. Been there since before the war. She'll have seen it all. I'm rather counting on that, Tuppence murmured. The Anchor's Rest perched at the edge of the harbour, its sign swinging mournfully in the sea wind. The smell of fish and damp rope mingled with frying onions from some unseen kitchen. Inside, the inn's small parlour glowed with coal fire and the steady tick of an old wool clock. Mrs. Harker, the innkeeper, was a sturdy woman in her 70s with a face seamed by wind and laughter, though the laughter had long since retired. She regarded Tuppence with sharp curiosity. "Lodging, miss?" she asked. "Just for a few nights," Tuppence replied. "But I'm also hoping to ask about someone who may have stayed here some years ago, around 1930, perhaps." The woman's brows drew together. "Aye, that'd be before my son took the boat south. What name?" Tuppence hesitated, then chose carefully. She might have used the name Anna Vale. Mrs. Harker's expression changed, the subtle tightening of memory. "Vale, you say? Pretty little thing. Dark hair, quiet, with that sad look some folk carry like luggage. Stayed a month, maybe less. Paid in cash, never gave an address." Tuppence's pulse quickened. "Do you remember what she did while here?" "Walked the cliffs mostly. Stood staring out to sea for hours. Wrote letters. Used to come down for ink and paper every few days. Then one morning she was gone. Left her room neat as a pin, but she'd forgotten a handkerchief. Embroidered A.G., I remember, because I thought it strange, not her initials." Tuppence's breath caught. A.G. Anna Gray. Mrs. Harker was watching her closely now. "You knew her?" "Not exactly," Tuppence said softly, "but I may know who she was." The older woman poured 2 cups of tea with deliberate ceremony. "Then you'll want to hear the rest. She wasn't alone the last time I saw her. There was a man, tall, wearing a sailor's cap. He came asking after her that night. I told him she'd gone, and he left without a word. But I saw him again a week later, watching the cliffs at dusk." Tuppence's hand tightened around the cup. "A sailor's cap?" Mrs. Harker nodded. "Aye, one of those dock men you can't quite place, the sort that vanish with the tide." The description sent a shiver through her. That same shadow had followed Tommy in London, the man by the docks, the watcher in the fog. "Did this man leave a name?" Tuppence asked. "None. Only the smell of salt and something unfinished." The fire cracked suddenly, throwing a small explosion of sparks into the grate. Tuppence rose slowly. "Thank you, Mrs. Harker. You've been more help than you know." As she turned toward the door, the old woman's voice stopped her. "Miss," she said quietly, "if you go walking the cliffs, mind where you stand. The sea takes what it's owed, but not always cleanly." That afternoon, Tuppence climbed the cliff path. The wind pressed against her coat, tugging like invisible hands. Below, the waves broke white against black rock, each surge dissolving into a hiss that seemed to whisper names. Anna, Eleanor. She stopped where the path narrowed and peered over the edge. The height made her dizzy, but her detective's mind drew the lines anyway. A fall, a splash, a body claimed by the sea. Only now, perhaps, that sea had returned something. A daughter, a vengeance, or a ghost. Kneeling, she brushed at the soil near a patch of wild thyme and saw a glint, a rusted tin button, half buried. A sailor's button. She pocketed it thoughtfully. "Whitby, 1918, she murmured. And again, Whitby, 1930. History doesn't repeat itself. It stalks its victims. As she descended back toward the harbour, church bells tolled faintly over the wind. Whitby Abbey loomed behind her like judgment. Meanwhile, in London, the fog had returned thicker than ever. Tommy Beresford was not fond of being followed, especially by amateurs. The man in the sailor's cap, the same one who had attacked Marnie, was back again, his silhouette ghosting along the opposite pavement whenever Tommy turned a corner. Tommy kept his stride casual, whistling faintly, and stopped before a tobacconist's window. In the reflection of the glass, he saw the man pause under a lamp, pretending to light a cigarette. "All right, my nautical friend," Tommy muttered under his breath. "Let's see who's steering this ship." He stepped suddenly into the street, crossing straight toward him. But as the distance closed, the man turned and vanished down an alley with the speed of a trained runner. Tommy followed, boots splashing through puddles, but the lane ended in emptiness. Only a piece of torn fabric fluttered on a nail. Coarse cloth, navy blue. Tommy pocketed it grimly. Another ghost with a sailor's wardrobe. We'll need an exorcist before this case is over. He turned back toward the main street and stopped dead. A figure stood outside their flat. The postman, sliding an envelope through the slot. Tommy waited until he was gone, then retrieved the letter. No return address, the same cream stationery, the same spidery hand. You will pay for what was done on Whitby Cliffs. But beneath, a new line had been added. The sea remembers its children. Tommy folded it carefully. Charming, he murmured, but the handwriting, my aquatic friend, will be your undoing. The next morning, he was at Scotland Yard's Forensics Division, a cluttered room smelling of ink, pipe tobacco, and patient men who preferred facts to theories. Inspector Haydock, an old acquaintance, raised a brow at the paper Tommy laid before him. You're back in the alphabet business, Beresford. Anonymous letters again? Handwriting first, Tommy said. Then ink composition. Haydock examined it with a magnifier. The ink's distinctive, blue-black with a green undertone. Used to be popular for naval correspondence. Hard to come by now. Only one manufacturer still makes it. A small shop up north, Whitby Way. Call themselves Stedman and Sons. Tommy's smile was tight. Whitby again. The sea does keep dragging us back. Careful, Beresford, Haydock said, half in jest. That coast's bad luck for your sort. Half the corpses we fish out down here have come drifting from Yorkshire. Then perhaps our murderer's trying to save you the trouble, Tommy replied. He left with the envelope safely sealed in his coat and a growing conviction that Whitby's tide was far from spent. That evening, as twilight deepened over the city, he returned home to find another letter on the hall table. Identical envelope, identical hand. This one, however, was addressed not to him, but to Mrs. Beresford. He slit it open. Inside, the same chilling script. You seek the daughter of Whitby. She walks where her mother fell. He stared at it for a long time, then reached for the telephone. The line crackled faintly before Tuppence's bright voice came through. Tommy, you sound miles away, which I suppose you are, he exhaled. And you sound entirely too cheerful for someone who's standing on cursed cliffs. Have you found anything? More than I expected, she said. The innkeeper remembered a girl calling herself Anna Vale. Eleanor's likeness exactly. She vanished from here 15 years ago. There was also a man watching her, wearing a sailor's cap. Tommy stiffened. The same man's been shadowing me. He's quicker than he looks, and he leaves souvenirs, including one navy button. Then he's part of this, Tommy. Maybe even Leonard's creature. Or someone else's. I've traced the ink from the letters, made in Whitby. Whoever's writing them is close to you. There was a brief pause. When Tuppence spoke again, her tone was steady but low. Then I'd better stop thinking of ghosts and start watching for living hands. After they rang off, Tuppence stood by her window at the inn, gazing out toward the restless black sweep of the sea. Lightning flickered far off the coast, lighting the ruins of the abbey for a heartbeat like a skeleton caught mid-prayer. She drew the journal from her bag and opened it again, letting the pages whisper in the lamplight. On the inside of the back cover, she noticed something she'd missed before, faint grooves near the corner, as if carved by a penknife. Tilting it toward the light, she made out letters scratched into the leather. A.G. Anna Gray. Below them, smaller, more recent marks. E.V. Eleanor Vale, she breathed. Mother and daughter, bound by initials, by secrets, by one man's lie. A knock startled her. She crossed to the door and opened it, but the corridor was empty. Only an envelope lay on the floor. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The same paper, the same ink. Inside, one line written in that spidery hand. You stand where she fell. The wind rose outside, rattling the window panes. Tuppence crossed to the hearth, staring into the fire. All right, she said quietly. If this is vengeance, let's see whose it really is. She reached for her coat. Whitby's cliffs waited, and somewhere beyond the roaring waves the truth was preparing to surface. London slept fitfully that night, wrapped in fog and the restless murmur of rain against windows. Hollow Street, usually silent after dark, was no exception, until, just after midnight, the quiet was torn apart by a single human cry. It began as a shout, sharp and disbelieving, then grew into a roar that echoed off the narrow facades. Within minutes, the still air filled with the smell of smoke, acrid, hungry, unmistakable. Number 12, Hollow Street, was burning. By the time Tommy and Tuppence arrived, their motorcar skidding to a halt under the glare of lamplight and chaos, the scene had already transformed into a tableau of panic. The night glowed with orange fury. Flames licked the upper windows, curling through broken glass like the tongues of some unleashed beast. Neighbours shouted, water buckets sloshed, and the shrill bell of the arriving fire engine pierced through the cacophony. Tommy leapt from the car, coughing as the smoke struck him full in the face. "Tuppence, stay back." She ignored him, of course. "Not a chance," she said, pulling her scarf over her mouth. "Felicia and Leonard are still inside." Even as she spoke, the front door burst open, and Leonard Grant stumbled out, half carrying, half dragging his wife. His face was blackened with soot, his hair wild, his eyes bright with the strange light of fire and fear. "Help me!" he gasped, falling to his knees on the pavement. "Felicia, she can't." Tommy grabbed Felicia under the arms and pulled her free. She was limp, gasping faintly, her face pale beneath the grime. Tuppence tore open her coat, pressing a handkerchief over her mouth. "She's alive," Tuppence said, voice tight with relief. "Barely, but alive." Behind them, one of the firemen shouted orders, and a jet of water arced through the smoky air, hissing as it met the flames. But the house was too far gone. The entire front was ablaze, the roof groaning under invisible pressure. Leonard staggered to his feet. "She's still in there," he cried hoarsely. "The girl, the governess, Eleanor." Tommy froze. "Eleanor Vale?" "Yes, I saw her. God help me, I saw her. She was upstairs. She had something in her hands." Before he could finish, a shape appeared in the window above, a flicker of white framed by fire. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. There she stood, Eleanor Vale, motionless, poised like an actress hitting her mark. Her face, ghost pale against the blaze, her dark hair loose and wild, the small journal clutched tightly to her chest. Tuppence's voice broke the spell. "Eleanor!" The figure turned toward the sound, one brief glance downward, eyes meeting Tuppence's through the drifting smoke. Then, without warning, a timbre cracked overhead. The ceiling gave way in a rush of sparks and flame. The window exploded outward in a shower of glass. The figure vanished in the inferno. Tuppence cried out, trying to lunge forward, but Tommy caught her arm just in time. "No!" he shouted over the roar. "It's no use, the whole place is coming down." Firemen rushed past them, axes glinting, hoses pounding, shouts and orders blending into one steady rhythm of chaos. The house moaned once, deeply, and then collapsed inward, a slow, terrible implosion of timbers, smoke and red light. All that remained was the smell of burning memories. An hour later, the fire was out, leaving only a skeleton of brick and steam. The rain had returned, hissing faintly as it met the smouldering ruin. Hollow Street stood crowded with watchers, faces ghostly in the glow of police lanterns. Tommy sat on the stone step of a neighbouring house, his overcoat soaked through. Tuppence stood beside him, arms folded, watching the heap of rubble where number 12 had once stood. "She was alive," she said quietly. "I saw her." Tommy nodded grimly. "So did I." "Then she's dead now." "Perhaps," he said, glancing toward the firemen still digging through the wreckage. "Or perhaps she's done it again." Tuppence looked at him sharply. "You think she staged it? Twice?" He shrugged slightly. "You saw her, Tuppence, standing there like a martyr in a painting. That wasn't fear. It was theatre." "But why?" "Because she wanted Leonard to see," he said. "She waited until he was outside. That look she gave before the flames took her. She was choosing her audience." Tuppence frowned. "But she had the journal. She wanted it destroyed. Or she wanted us to think so." One of the firemen approached, holding a small blackened object wrapped in a cloth. "Found this near what's left of the sitting room," he said. "Looks like a book of some sort. Thought you might know the folks." Tuppence unwrapped it carefully. The journal lay there, scorched at the edges, the leather brittle and cracked. The first few pages were gone, but near the back, half-burned lines of writing still survived. Tommy leaned closer, reading aloud. The choice was his. He looked up slowly. Not hers then. His. Tuppence's eyes widened. "Leonard." They both turned toward where he sat, head bowed beside his wife on a borrowed blanket. Felicia was conscious again, murmuring weakly, but Leonard was beyond speech, his hands trembling, his eyes hollow. Inspector Haydock arrived just then, his coat collar up against the drizzle. "Faulty wiring, they say," he announced briskly. "Old house like that, it happens. We'll confirm in the morning." Tommy shook his head. "Too convenient, Haydock. The Grants receive threatening letters, their governess disappears, their house conveniently burns down the day after she's seen alive. If that's coincidence, I'll retire from deduction altogether." Haydock gave him a wary look. "You think it's murder?" "I think it's message," Tommy said quietly. Eleanor Vale wanted the world to see the house burn, to erase her mother's past and expose the man who profited from it. Tuppence was still studying the charred pages. "Look here," she murmured. "This ink. It's newer. The same shade as the letters. She wrote in it recently, maybe even last night." Tommy nodded. Then she left her confession in plain sight, knowing fire would make it the only thing anyone would find. Haydock folded his arms. "So what's your theory? She starts the blaze, regrets it, and gets trapped." "Or never meant to die at all," Tommy said. "If she had time to plan the letters, she had time to plan an exit. The body's gone because there wasn't one to find." Tuppence exhaled slowly. A vanishing act, twice over. Eleanor Vale, Anna Gray's daughter, whichever name she used, she's a ghost by choice. Felicia's faint voice broke the silence. She wasn't a ghost. They turned. The woman's eyes were open now, unfocused but lucid. "She came earlier that evening. She asked to see Leonard. I heard her voice in the hall. I thought it was a dream. She said, 'I'm here for what you owe.'" Leonard stirred beside her, but she didn't look at him. "She wasn't angry," Felicia continued. "She was calm. I begged Leonard to tell her the truth, but he—" She stopped, a shiver passing through her. Then she left, and an hour later, the fire began. Tommy crouched beside her. "Did she take anything with her?" "The journal," Felicia whispered. "And something else. A photograph, the one we kept locked in the desk. The sea behind it, the cliffs, and Leonard standing beside Anna Gray." Tuppence met Tommy's eyes. "So Eleanor knew. She came for proof." Felicia looked up suddenly, fear flashing through her exhaustion. "If she's alive, she'll come back. Not for me, for him." Leonard rose unsteadily, his voice low and raw. "Let her. I've lived with ghosts long enough. Perhaps one more will finish the job." Haydock frowned. "We'll need a statement from both of you in the morning." But Leonard wasn't listening. He stared into the smoking ruins, his silhouette framed by the faint glow of the last embers. "Faulty wiring," he muttered. "Is that what they'll call it? No. Fire doesn't start itself, Mr. Beresford. It remembers." Tuppence shivered. "Tommy, let's take Felicia to hospital." He nodded, but his eyes lingered on the wreckage. "Yes," he said softly. "And after that, we find out what fire was meant to hide and what it chose to reveal." Later, as dawn crept reluctantly over London, the firemen packed up their hoses and the crowd drifted away. Only the Beresfords remained for a final glance at the ruins. The house at number 12 was nothing but ash and silence now, a monument to choices made in fear and atonement. Tuppence slipped her arm through Tommy's. "If she survived, she's done it brilliantly. No one will believe otherwise." Tommy nodded absently. Perhaps that was her real revenge, not to kill but to vanish again, leaving guilt to burn in her place. They turned to leave, but something caught the pale light near the curb, a small object half buried in wet ash. Tommy bent and picked it up. It was a button, tarnished, brass, engraved faintly with an anchor. He turned it over in his palm. "Our sailor again," he murmured. "Where there's sea and fire, he's never far behind." Tuppence met his gaze. The fog swirling around them like breath. Then this isn't over. Tommy pocketed the button, eyes narrowing toward the horizon where smoke met dawn. "No," he said, "not yet. But one way or another, the tide's coming in." The night had burned itself out. By the time dawn crept into London, pale and uncertain, the last of the smoke had drifted away from Hollow Street. Rain had fallen in the small hours, washing the ashes into dark rivulets along the gutter. What remained of number 12 was no longer a house but a hollow shell, blackened walls, jagged chimneys, and silence. Tommy Beresford stood beside the ruins with his hands in his pockets, collar turned up against the chill. The world smelled of damp soot and weary conscience. Behind him, the clatter of a constable's boots echoed faintly across the cobbles. He looked up as Tuppence approached, her face pale but steady under the brim of her hat. "Morning," she said softly. "Barely," he murmured. "The fire's out, but the story isn't." Tuppence's gaze drifted to the ruins. "Felicia's at the hospital. They say she'll recover." "And Leonard?" Tommy's tone carried no warmth. "At Scotland Yard," she replied. "Inspector Haydock's been with him since 5. He sent word, Leonard wants to speak to us." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "The guilty always want an audience. Shall we indulge him?" Tuppence's eyes were tired but resolute. "Let's hear what the fire didn't destroy." At the yard, the morning light filtered weakly through barred windows. The interrogation room smelled faintly of tobacco and damp wool. Leonard Grant sat at the small metal table, a blanket draped over his shoulders, the stains of smoke still ingrained in his skin. His hands, manicured once, now shaking, rested flat before him. Inspector Haydock nodded to the Beresfords as they entered. "He asked for you by name," he said quietly. "Says he's ready to clear the slate." Leonard looked up as they approached, eyes bloodshot but lucid. "Mr. Beresford, Mrs. Beresford, I've been a fool." Tommy leaned against the wall. "An observation we can all agree on. The question is, which sort?" Leonard's mouth twisted faintly, almost a smile. "The sort who believes he can manage truth as if it were a business ledger, balancing columns of guilt against advantage." Tuppence took the chair opposite him. "You forced your wife to identify Anna Gray," she said quietly, "and you've been forcing yourself to justify it ever since." He didn't flinch. "Felicia was weak," he said, "but I was the one who made her so. The courier, Anna Gray, had stumbled onto a code system I was selling to a rival contact. She threatened exposure. The authorities were closing in, and I needed a scapegoat. Felicia was young, terrified. She would do anything I told her, especially if I made it seem noble." "You used her love," Tuppence said. He nodded slowly. "Yes. I told her it was for the country, for victory. She believed me, and I let her bear the weight. I thought it was over when the war ended, but sins have a way of breeding." Tommy folded his arms. "The letters." Leonard gave a small, brittle laugh. "Yes. They began a few months ago. Anonymous, but I knew immediately. Someone had found the truth, or pretended to. Felicia was breaking down, and I couldn't afford another scandal. I hired Eleanor Vale." Tuppence's eyes flashed. "You hired her?" "Yes. She was recommended by a colleague's wife. Efficient, discreet. I told her I needed a governess, but in truth I wanted someone to divert suspicion. I gave her fragments of the story, enough to convince her that Felicia's fear was unfounded, that the letters were a prank. I even asked her to send 1 or 2 herself, to make the threat seem external, manageable. It worked for a while. Then she found the journal." Tuppence's voice hardened, and realized the prank was no prank at all. Leonard's eyes flicked toward her. "She came to me one night, said she'd been to Whitby, that she knew who Anna Gray was. She said she could no longer be part of it. She wanted to go to the police." "So, you silenced her," Tommy said flatly. Leonard exhaled. "I tried to reason with her. I offered money. She refused. The next morning she vanished. I thought she'd gone to the papers, but no story appeared. Then the sailor came." Tommy's eyes narrowed. "Jack Marney." Leonard nodded. "He was Anna Gray's cousin. He'd traced the letters, learned my name. He came to demand payment, not money but confession. Said I'd ruined his family. I told him to leave, that he'd no proof. But Eleanor heard. She followed him. After that night I didn't see either again until—" He broke off, staring down at his hands. "Until the fire." The room fell silent except for the faint patter of rain on the windows. Tuppence leaned forward. "So Eleanor came back. Why?" Leonard's voice was barely audible. "To finish it. She told me she'd written everything down, that she'd send it to the authorities. She said she didn't want revenge, only justice. But the way she looked at me, she was her mother's face reborn. I struck her. She ran. That was the last I saw before the flames." Tommy's jaw tightened. Convenient timing for a man who loves tidy conclusions. Haydock stepped forward. That's enough, Grant. You're under arrest for conspiracy and obstruction of justice, and likely more once we find the body. Leonard didn't resist. He rose slowly, his shoulders bowed. You won't find it, he said. Eleanor was cleverer than any of us. She's beyond your reach now. Felicia's voice broke the tension. She had entered quietly, wrapped in a hospital cloak, pale but upright. Leonard, she whispered, stop. Haydock moved to protest, but Tommy raised a hand. Felicia crossed to her husband, her movements slow but certain. You've spoken enough lies for a lifetime, she said. Let this be the first truth you ever gave willingly. Leonard looked at her, the defiance fading from his face. Felicia, she shook her head. Don't. You took everything from me. My peace, my brother's safety, my conscience. But I won't let you take my forgiveness too. That I'll give freely, and it will burn longer than any fire you set. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, I suppose I deserve no less. When the constables led him away, his footsteps echoed down the corridor like punctuation on a long, tragic sentence. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft, steady, cleansing. The street lamps flickered out one by one as the grey morning took hold. Felicia stood beneath the yard's awning, her face turned toward the faint light. I thought confession would kill me, she murmured. But perhaps it's a kind of mercy. The past can't be undone, but it can stop dragging me under. Tuppence placed a gentle hand on her arm. You've carried enough ghosts. Let them rest. Felicia managed a trembling smile. If only they'll let me. She turned and walked slowly toward the waiting cab, a frail figure receding into the dawn. Back at their flat, the fire in the grate had burned low, its embers a faint heartbeat against the quiet. Tommy poured 2 cups of tea while Tuppence sorted the Morning Post. Most of it was dull. Bills, circulars, 1 postcard from an old friend in Bournemouth. She was about to set it aside when something caught her eye. The card was unmarked except for a pressed flower, pale, brittle, carefully affixed, and a single line written beneath it in fine, elegant script. Justice is not vengeance. There was no signature, no address, only a faint trace of sea salt on the paper. Tuppence's breath caught. She handed it to Tommy. He studied it for a moment, then smiled faintly. From Whitby? The postmark says so. He turned the card over again, admiring the pressed blossom. A forget-me-not. Delicate choice for someone who prefers dramatic exits. Tuppence sat down opposite him. She's alive, Tommy, I knew it. The fire was another performance, one last scene to end her mother's story properly. He nodded slowly. Yes, she's avenged Anna Gray, but on her own terms. She let the law finish Leonard, not flame or fury. I suppose that's justice of a kind. Tuppence looked toward the window, where rain traced fine silver lines down the glass. Justice isn't always clean, she said softly, but it's sometimes kind. She spared Felicia. Tommy set the card on the mantelpiece, and herself. For a while they sat in silence, the clock ticking steadily between them. The war, the lies, the ghosts of Whitby, all seemed to dissolve in the quiet rhythm of the rain. At last Tommy spoke, his voice reflective. You know, Tuppence, we chase mysteries thinking they end with answers, but they rarely do. They end with echoes of choices made and chances lost. Tuppence smiled faintly. Even reckless choices? Especially those, he said. They're the ones that refuse to stay buried. She leaned back in her chair, eyes half closed. Perhaps that's all right, as long as there are hearts brave enough to face them. Tommy raised his cup in a small salute, to hearts that still hope. Tuppence clinked her cup against his, and to ghosts who finally rest. Outside, the rain washed London clean again, at least for a while. Morning broke over Whitby in a hush of pale silver and sea wind. The cliffs, dark against the mist, rose solemnly above the restless tide. Gulls wheeled and cried overhead, their voices thin and lonely, as if echoing some memory too old to name. Tommy and Tuppence Beresford stood at the edge of the worn path that led up from the town, the hem of Tuppence's coat fluttering in the cold breeze. Below them the waves folded and unfolded with steady patience, each one striking the rocks like a heartbeat that refused to stop. It looks almost peaceful, Tommy said quietly. Hard to believe a place with such a view could hold so many ghosts. Tuppence smiled faintly. Peaceful places often do. The noise of the city drowns them out. But here, she gestured toward the sea, they have all the silence they need. They walked slowly along the cliff's edge. The grass was damp with dew, the air rich with the scent of salt and heather. Tuppence stopped after a few steps, her gaze fixed ahead. At the base of a weathered stone marker, uninscribed, anonymous, lay a small bouquet of fresh wildflowers, violets, daisies, a sprig of thyme. The stems were still wet as though placed only that morning. Tuppence knelt, her gloved fingers brushing the petals. "Someone's been here," she said softly. Tommy glanced around, scanning the empty cliffs. Recently, too. No footprints, but the wind here wouldn't allow many to last. She didn't answer immediately. Her expression was thoughtful, far away. "Do you remember what Felicia said before she left London? That she dreamt of a girl standing on these cliffs, smiling, holding a flower she couldn't name?" Tommy nodded. "I remember. And I remember thinking grief plays cruel tricks." "And yet," Tuppence said quietly, "sometimes it doesn't need to." She rose, looking out over the sea. The wind caught her hair, carrying the faintest scent of salt and wild thyme. Somewhere far below, the tide rushed through a cleft in the rocks, murmuring like a voice half heard in sleep. Tommy watched her for a moment, then said gently, "You think she's alive?" Tuppence turned toward him, her eyes reflecting both mist and certainty. "No, Tommy, I know she is. The postcard, the pressed flower, it wasn't a farewell, it was a promise. Eleanor Vale has her own kind of peace now, and it doesn't need graves or apologies." He looked back toward the bouquet, nodding slowly. "Justice is not vengeance," he murmured, recalling the line from her final message. And yet somehow it found both. They stood there for a while without speaking. The sea went on whispering, tireless, eternal. A ship moved in the distance, its dark hull cutting through the fog like a slow thought. Tuppence wrapped her coat closer. "Felicia wrote last week," she said after a pause. "She's gone to her sister in the country. She said the nights are quieter now. I think she'll mend." Tommy smiled faintly. "People do, in time. The living always must. That's the unkind part of survival. You're obliged to go on." She looked up at him, her expression soft. "You almost sound like a philosopher." He grinned. "Don't worry, it's only temporary. Once we're back in London, I'll be quite myself again, demanding tea, misplacing reports, and pretending I enjoy bookkeeping." Tuppence laughed under her breath. "Our agency could use a little less philosophy and a little more solvable burglary, I suppose." "Exactly. Give me a good stolen diamond over moral riddles any day." They began the walk back down toward the harbour, their steps slow and unhurried. The path curved past the old abbey ruins, its stones slick with sea mist. From below came the faint clang of a buoy bell, steady as a metronome. "Still," Tuppence said after a moment, "I think we needed this one. To remember what war leaves behind. Not just medals and graves, but choices, made in fear, in love, in recklessness. They ripple through time, Tommy, until someone finds the courage to stop them." He glanced at her, his tone gentler than his words. "And that someone, as usual, was you." Tuppence smiled. "Oh, I had help. A postcard, a pressed flower, and a man who always insists on following me into trouble." Tommy chuckled. "I'd call it partnership. Sounds better when you're explaining it to the police." They reached the last bend in the path, where the cliffs gave way to the narrow cobbled streets of Whitby below. The town was just waking, shopkeepers sweeping their thresholds, fishermen calling across the harbour, the smell of fresh bread mingling with coal smoke. The church bell struck 8. Tuppence turned for one last glance at the cliffs. The mist was lifting now, revealing the high curve of land against the morning sky. For an instant, she thought she saw a figure, distant, motionless, standing where the flowers had been laid. A woman, perhaps, with a scarf caught by the wind. Then the clouds shifted, and the space was empty again. Tuppence didn't mention it. She only smiled faintly and slipped her arm through Tommy's. "Come along, darling. If we linger any longer, you'll start writing poetry about tides and redemption." "Not a chance," Tommy said cheerfully. "I'm saving my poetry for invoices and client ledgers." They walked down into the heart of the town, side by side. Behind them the sea moved on, eternal, forgiving, washing clean what could never truly be forgotten. Later that day, when they boarded the train for London, the afternoon light slanted through the carriage window, gilding Tuppence's hair. Tommy leaned back in his seat, reading the newspaper without interest. "Anything in the headlines?" she asked. He shook his head. "Only the usual. Parliament, trade disputes, a missing parrot in Bayswater. Nothing half as dramatic as our recent adventure." "Good," she said softly. "Let the world be ordinary for a while." Outside, the landscape unrolled, moors fading into fields, fields into city smoke. The rhythm of the train seemed to carry their thoughts forward, leaving the echoes of Whitby behind. Tuppence watched the passing countryside, her reflection faint against the glass. "Tommy," she said after a long silence. "Yes?" "If we ever have to make a reckless choice of our own," she said quietly, "promise me we'll make it together." He smiled, taking her hand. "Always." The train thundered on toward London, the sky clearing by degrees. Far behind them, on the cliffs above the sea, the wind scattered a few petals from the forgotten bouquet, white and violet, and carried them gently out over the waves. For a moment, they danced there in the sunlight before vanishing into the horizon, where sea and sky met in endless, forgiving blue.